Revelation 2419. From the 22nd of July 1942. Godhood. The probationary period on earth is of utmost importance for the human being or his soul insofar as it finally leaves earth at the end of it, irrespective of how far the soul has developed upwards, but the soul's degree of maturity is now decisive for its new environment and activity in the beyond. The activity on earth is finally over, even if it was unsuccessful for the soul. In a sense, a time of grace has ended, whether it was used rightly or wrongly. But both have serious consequences in the hereafter. The time on earth is only short but nevertheless decisive for eternity, for although the soul can still continue to educate itself in the beyond, it is nevertheless no longer able to develop as it could have done in a correctly used earthly life. It cannot attain childship to God, for this requires a way of life on earth which completely corresponds to God's will. It requires a degree of maturity at the human being's death which already allows entry into spheres of light. The human being must already shape himself into a being of light on earth, which is entirely within his power if he musters the will to do so. Hence he has to make full use of the grace of embodiment as a human being. He has to consciously strive towards God and seek unification with Him already on earth through prayer and activity of love. God's demand of people is nothing impossible, for the allocation of His grace, the granting of His help, also corresponds to His demand. Only the human being's will is required. And this usually fails. Consequently, the highest cannot be granted to the beings in the beyond because they did not strive for it on earth. The childship to God is the most blissful state which makes the being infinitely happy in the beyond, for it grants the being the Father's inheritance. It can create and shape the being with God through His strength. If the soul has lived a life of love on earth, the separation from God has finally been overcome, it is close to God. It has found its way back to its origin, it has become one with Him. And earthly life was given to the soul for this purpose. However, God does not abandon the spiritual being which did not use its earthly life in accordance with His will and also gives it constant opportunities of ascent in the beyond. And thus even these souls can still reach a state of light and happiness which, however, differs from that of a child of God. For a child of God also becomes a giver of strength, as it were, because it absorbs God's direct emanation into itself, because it is in closest contact with God, and it can now constantly distribute this strength since it is permeated by God's strength itself. To be a child of God means to be completely merged with Him, consequently also to be able to dispose of His might and strength. Humanity does not grasp what this means and therefore does not grasp the significance of earthly life either, which can bring the soul something inconceivably blissful and yet is mostly lived without regard for it. The higher development, which is still possible in the beyond, is an act of God's greatest mercy, who has given earthly life to the being for its final purification and higher development. But who, in His immense love, still enables the beings whose will failed on earth to ascend in the beyond in order to provide them with bliss and light, yet still dependent on the beings' will. However, these beings cannot attain the bliss of a child of God unless they travel the path on earth once more, if God grants them this grace which is linked to a task on earth. Then the soul will have to struggle once more, although it will be protected from complete relapse by the beings of light, because it must already have reached a certain degree of maturity in the beyond before it is granted this great grace through God's great love. The fulfillment of its task, which applies to the salvation of fellow human beings' souls, can now earn it that degree of maturity on earth which makes it a child of God. Yet it is always up to the soul's will how it uses the renewed granting of the grace of embodiment on earth. Amen.